Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Millerman, millermanschool.com. I offer courses on politics and philosophy, and on this channel, I'll talk about the same topics. So, as all of you know, it's been a wild last few days in US politics, and I want to just focus in on one aspect of it, which is Trump's nomination of JD Vance as his vice presidential candidate. A lot of articles have come out in the last few days about the intellectual influences on JD Vance's worldview, and I just thought it could be interesting to go through some of those together. So this one is from politico.com. The 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview: post-liberals, crunchy cons, and monarchists. So let me just preface this by saying that if you are a fan of this channel, if you've watched it before, or in general, if you are in the circles of the online right, in the circles of the kind of, how could you put it? You're not a Democrat, you're not a leftist, you're not a communist, but you're also not mainstream GOP, you're not mainstream Republican, not mainstream conservative. So you, I think, were, like many people, energized by the selection of JD Vance as Trump's VP. Because JD Vance runs in some of the circles, or at least has been on some of the shows and published in some of the journals that you like and that I like and that you read and listen to. And so it's been a sort of energizing moment, I would say, for the intellectual right. And that's why I wanted to cover these articles with you. So let's take a look. I have not really read them yet in advance. I just sort of bookmarked them to do this together. Let's go. Politico, the 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview. By the way, I'd love to hear from you, as always, in the comments, in the chat. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you had a chance to stay up late enough to watch Trump's RNC speech last night, which we could also talk about a little bit later. So JD Vance represents something genuinely unusual for the MAGA movement: a national Republican who is deeply enmeshed with the elite world of the conservative intellectual movement, or what's sometimes termed for convenience as the new right or the dissident right. As Vance himself confessed earlier this year, he is plugged into a lot of weird right-wing subcultures. His transition from never Trump conservative to MAGA firebrand was influenced by his relationships with a handful of niche conservative writers and thinkers. Among them are people who push for post-liberal regime change, some who pine for the cultural conservatism of Viktor Orban's Hungary, and one outright monarchist. This cohort espouses a variety of sometimes competing viewpoints, but they are bound together by the belief that the liberal project of progress, especially in the form of economic liberalization, technological advancement, and the leveling of social hierarchies, has in fact been a mistake. Now I'll just pause here. Again, many of the authors that I discuss on this channel, in my books and writings, and at my school, they also are bound together by the belief that the liberal project of progress has in fact been a mistake, whether we take the more moderate among them like Leo Strauss, or the less moderate among them like Alexander Dugin. So we're in this world here of the quote-unquote new right or dissident right, those people who are suspicious of the liberal project of progress. Many of these thinkers are still far, far away from being household names, but with Vance on the top of the GOP ticket, they're only one step away from having a direct line to the White House. Here are the key thinkers who have influenced JD Vance's intellectual trajectory, and if November goes Republicans' way, could define the trajectory of the country. So we start, according to politico.com, with Patrick Deneen. A professor of political theory at the University of Notre Dame, Deneen rose to prominence in 2018 with the publication of his book, Why Liberalism Failed, a sweeping critique of small L liberalism and a forceful argument for a more communitarian approach to American political life. In the book, which won plaudits from Barack Obama and the New York Times, Deneen argued that liberalism's focus on individualism, secularism, and free market economics eroded the communal bases of American life, namely the nuclear family, shared religious faith, and local economies. Let me just pause for a minute. Guys, you can let me know whether you've read Deneen's book. I did. It is interesting. If you're familiar with Dugin, it's going to seem light to you, but it is still worth knowing and worth a read. Deneen took a more radical approach in his next major book, Regime Change, published in 2023. In the book, Deneen, who is a conservative Catholic, argued for a peaceful revolution to replace liberalism with a post-liberal order, grounded in the promotion of conservative and religious values, rather than the protection of individual rights. In practice, Deneen argued for a pro-family and pro-worker economic policy, for pro-family and pro-worker economic policies like tariffs and manufacturing incentives, as well as foreign policy isolationism and strict social conservatism, including limits on gay marriage, gender-affirming care, and abortion. Vance has publicly cited Deneen as a major intellectual influence and even appeared on a panel with him at the book launch for Regime Change, hosted at Catholic University in 2023. At the event, Vance identified himself as member of the post-liberal right and said he views his role in Congress as explicitly anti-regime, channeling Deneen's critique, I guess that would be, of liberal progressivism. In a statement after Vance's election, Deneen praised him as a man of deep personal faith and integrity, a devoted family man, a generous friend, and a genuine patriot. Okay, so first influence, according to Politico.com, Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed and Regime Change, the two books that are important points of reference. Now, Peter Thiel. By the way, if any of you know, there was an article, I think it was MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, that came out about Peter Thiel and JD Vance and how they are part of a kind of technological anti-liberal cabal that names their companies in honor of characters from Lord of the Rings. And so I just want to tell you that I've now rebranded to GandalfSchool.com instead of MillermanSchool.com. And so if you go to GandalfSchool.com, now I'm part of the Lord of the Rings International Technological Anti-Liberal Cabal. Okay, GandalfSchool.com. So Peter Thiel. Thiel is best known as Vance's former venture capital boss and the primary funder of his 2022 Senate campaign, but he's also a close friend and major influence for Vance. Sorry, I want to pause one more time. Guys, you should know more seriously that if you don't know a lot about Peter Thiel, about what he thinks, okay, that's a big topic in and of itself. I'm not an expert on everything having to do with Thiel, but I have covered his famous seminal essay, The Straussian Moment, on this channel, which you might like to have a look at some point. The duo's relationship began in 2011 when Vance, then a student at Yale Law School, attended a talk by Thiel in which he tied Silicon Valley's failure to deliver truly revolutionary technologies to the stagnation of America's political and social elites. As Vance later wrote of Thiel's vision, quote, he saw these two trends, elite professionals trapped in hyper-competitive jobs and the technological stagnation of society, as connected. If technological innovation were actually driving real prosperity, our elites wouldn't feel increasingly competitive with one another over a dwindling number of prestigious outcomes, unquote. Thiel's political outlook is complex and contradictory, according to Politico.com, but it revolves around the idea that misguided liberal ideology, sclerotic government bureaucracy, and feckless elites have perverted the trajectory of technological progress, turning technology into a tool of national and civilizational destruction rather than renewal. As Thiel famously put it, we wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. Vance, meaning, we got Twitter, we didn't get flying cars. Vance has not explained publicly exactly how much of Thiel's worldview he shares, but the two men are close friends and regular conversation partners. My relationship with Peter is what it has been for the close to 15 years that I've known him, Vance told Politico magazine earlier this year. If there's something interesting going on and I want to bounce ideas off a very fascinating and knowledgeable person, I'll give him a call. Okay, so you got to think about it. Do you consider Thiel's influence on JD Vance to be a good one or a bad one? I would consider it personally to be a good one because you want to have smart people in your circles. And if you read Thiel's Straussian Moment, or if you want to read something kind of more down to earth, but nevertheless insightful and maybe even deceptively simple, you can read Thiel's 0 to 1. Wouldn't you want a guy like that in your corner? You got to kind of think about it. I think that's not a bad influence to have, a good influence to have. So now we go to the third one on Politico.com's list of influences on JD Vance, Curtis Yarvin. We've covered a little bit of Curtis Yarvin on this channel in the past. Yarvin doesn't hold any official title or office. He is an ex-computer programmer turned blogger, having first risen to prominence on the online right in the 2010s while blogging under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. But he's often cited as the house philosopher of the new right, chiefly for his promotion of the neo-reactionary or NRX movement. Like Deneen, Yarvin and his NRX neo-reactionary followers reject the quest for progress as the core of political life. As Yarvin told Vanity Fair in 2022, the fundamental premise of liberalism is that there is this inexorable march toward progress. I disagree with that premise. Instead, Yarvin believes that American democracy has denigrated into a corrupt oligarchy run by elites who strive to consolidate their power rather than serve the public interest. The solution, Yarvin argues, is for the American oligarchy to give way to a monarchical leader styled after a startup CEO, a national CEO, or what's called a dictator, as Yarvin has put it, who can debug the American political order like a computer programmer debugging some bad code. Vance has said he considers Yarvin a friend and has cited his writings in connection with his plan to fire a significant number of civil servants during a potential second Trump administration. There's this guy, Curtis Yarvin, who has written about some of these things, Vance said on a conservative podcast in 2021, adding, I think Trump is going to run again in 2024, and I think what Trump should do, if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state, replace them with our people. Now, by the way, we won't click through to this link here, but this is going to be the Jack Murphy Live podcast that's referred to. Okay, you see clips of Vance on Jack Murphy Live podcast circulating online. That's where this clip is taken from. And that podcast is no longer around, but if you look at who was on it back in the day, 2021, I was on it several times. JD Vance was on it. Chris Rufo was on it. Curtis Yarvin was on it. Michael Anton was on it. Okay, some good and interesting debates and discussions were had on the Jack Murphy Live podcast back then. So that's where that is from. And as I say, if you're interested in me and this channel, I was on there as well a couple of times. But let's go on. Alexander Dugin was on that podcast too, as a matter of fact. So, but they're quoting Vance's appearance where he said that you should fire every civil servant in the administrative state and replace them with our people. Okay, next influence on this list, Politico.com. Okay, on JD Vance's worldview, we have Renee Girard, somebody that I don't cover on this channel very often. I don't discuss very often. I think he has good, competent expositors besides myself, so I typically leave that in the hands of others. But let's see what they say here about Girard's influence on JD Vance. A French-born philosopher and Catholic literary critic, Girard taught for several decades at Stanford University, where his acolytes included Peter Thiel. Thiel, in turn, introduced Girard's ideas to his own protege. Vance has said that he was particularly influenced by Girard's idea of mimetic rivalry, the idea that humans want certain things because they see other people wanting those same things, and his related idea of the scapegoat myth, that this competition for shared goals and objects leads to social and political conflict, which most societies ultimately resolve by committing an act of violence against a perceived outsider. To Girard, early Christians were the first group to escape this cycle of violence because they scapegoated one of their own, Jesus Christ, rather than an outsider. Vance has credited his exposure to Girard via Thiel as a major impetus for his conversion to Catholicism in 2019. Mired in the swamp of social media, we identified a scapegoat and digitally pounced. We were keyboard warriors unloading on people via Facebook and Twitter, blind to our own problems. We fought over jobs we didn't actually want while pretending we didn't fight for them at all, Vance wrote in a 2020 essay. That all had to change. It was time to stop scapegoating and focus on what I could do to improve things. Vance's conversion, however, hasn't put an entire stop to his days of online trolling. Okay, those of you who are here now or who are just checking in, we're looking at the intellectual sources of JD Vance's worldview, since some articles on that have come out recently, and we like this sort of topic since often it relates to authors that I discuss on this channel, or outlets that you read and I read. So that's what we're going over. The 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview. This was published in Politico.com. Quick little review here. We have Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed, as well as his book, Regime Change. We have Peter Thiel, author of The Straussian Moment, which I've covered on this channel, 0 to 1, which I teach at another project of mine. If you go to visionxform.com, you'll see that. So Peter Thiel is another influence. Curtis Yarvin has some hardcore followers. Maybe you are one of them. Renee Girard. And now we go down to Sohrab Ahmari. The writer Sohrab Ahmari's political evolution is arguably even more circuitous than Vance's. The son of a secular Iranian family, he emigrated to the US as a teenager, became a Trotskyist in college, and then took up the neoconservative cause as an editor at the Wall Street Journal before converting to Catholicism in 2016. The same year he voted for Hillary Clinton out of disgust for Trump. He has since moved rightward, embracing Trump and becoming a chief advocate for a new style of working class conservatism that has its roots in the tradition of Catholic social democracy, which Ahmari describes half-jokingly as pro-life New Dealism. Now he's the editor of Compact Magazine, an online journal that nominally brings together the populist left and right, but which has assertively promoted both Trump and Vance. By the way, I'll say I published a piece on the assassination of Darya Dugin, Dugin's daughter, in Compact Magazine, and you might want to take a look at that at some point. Ahmari, meanwhile, remains close with Vance, having profiled him for several publications and hosted him at a buzzy conference for common good conservatives in 2022. In an interview with Political Magazine after Trump's selection, Ahmari said he was thrilled to have Vance on the ticket. Donald Trump could have listened to the advice of many other characters and picked a conventional Republican, he said. Instead, he picked someone who's reviled by the keepers of the orthodoxy on free trade and foreign policy, and who is also in line with the kind of RNC platform that we saw released last week. He added, if you want to push that platform, JD is the man to do it. Okay, next influence on JD Vance, according to Politico.com, is the Claremont Institute. Based out of San Bernardino County, California, the Claremont Institute has become the intellectual nerve center of the Trumpist right since 2016, serving as the home to scholars like Michael Anton, whose famous 2016 Flight 93 essay offered an early intellectual justification for Trump, as well as former Trump attorney John Eastman, who has been indicted for his role in trying to overturn the 2020 election. By the way, let me just pause here and tell you that I have done an interview with Michael Anton as well on Leo Strauss's book, Thoughts on Machiavelli. And you might like the conversations that I've had with Michael Anton. Check that out, okay? So Michael Anton is one of the scholars at Claremont, one of these influences on JD Vance. Aside from its embrace of Trumpism, the Institute is known as the home of West Coast Straussianism, a school of American political philosophy pioneered by the conservative historian and philosopher Harry Jaffa. Now, those of you who are watching and don't know, Straussianism, I here add, okay, this isn't the article, this is me telling you, has to do with the scholar of the history of political philosophy, Leo Strauss. That's the same Strauss that came up in the Thiel influence when I mentioned Thiel's essay, The Straussian Moment. So guys, you might want to learn something about Leo Strauss if you don't know who he is. I've covered him on this channel. I cover him in my school. He's an extremely important source for me personally. Leo Strauss, if you don't know who he is, get on it. The Institute's scholars and fellows hold a range of political positions, but they're united by the belief that America lost touch with its founding ideas somewhere around the progressive era, driven by government bureaucratization, the loss of public faith in the principles of natural law, and the rise of moral relativism and multiculturalism, what could be called wokeism in today's parlance. Unlike Yarvin or Deneen, the Claremont crew tend to advocate a return to founding American principles like limited government and the protection of natural rights. In practical terms, this has led them to enthusiastically take up Trump's crusade against the administrative state and woke initiatives like DEI and critical race theory. Vance, okay, JD Vance, Trump's VP pick, is closely tied to Claremont circles, frequently speaking at their events and appearing alongside their scholars. In a statement to the American Conservative on Monday, Claremont President Ryan Williams called Vance the ideal pick for Trump's vice president, adding it's hard to find a more articulate and passionate advocate for the politics and policies that will save American democracy from the forces of progressive oligarchy and despotism. All right, good to be with everybody as we cover this Politico.com article on the intellectual sources of JD Vance's worldview. Hopefully you are enjoying this, and if you're a longer time fan of this channel, if you're somebody who's been following this channel, then many of these names should be familiar to you, including names that are beneath the surface here, like Leo Strauss, who's only been mentioned in passing as an important figure. So next is Rod Dreher. I've never heard his last name pronounced. I assume it's something like that. The Orthodox Christian writer and former American conservative columnist is best known as the leader of the Crunchy Ones, the Birkenstocked Burkians, and gun-loving organic farmers, who embrace the countercultural, back to the land attitudes typically associated with the hippie left, but are themselves on the intellectual right. Dreher subsequently made a national splash with his 2017 book, The Benedict Option, which counseled Christian conservatives to embrace exile from the mainstream culture and construct a resilient counterculture based on the Christian virtues. Since then, he has relocated primarily to Hungary, where he's become something of an intellectual consigliere in Viktor Orban's government. His latest book, which got a friendly plug from Vance, is subtitled A Manual for Christian Dissidents. His friendship with Vance began in 2016 when he became an early champion of hillbilly elegy on the right, calling it one of the best books I've ever read, and conducting a much talked about interview with Vance for the American Conservative. Dreher's blog got booted from the magazine last year after his primary funder thought it had gotten too weird. The two remained friends, and he even attended Vance's baptism into the Catholic faith in Ohio in 2019. Guys, I want to say here briefly, I told you where I'm reading from, Politico.com, and you see, if you're looking, maybe you're just listening, but if you're looking, you see that some of these passages have links to them, okay? So his conversation, his interview with Vance, there's a link there. So if you guys want to dig deeper into the sources that are discussed here, you go check out the article, click on the links, and follow the White Rabbit or whatever. Okay, I need to send our next vice president a copy of the Benedict Option. Dreher joked online after Vance's selection. And then there's a clarification. This article has been updated to clarify Amari's role at Compact Magazine, as well as the details of Deneen's political views. So that was, let's just do a super fast review of this, the 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview. We'll go one by one. Number 1, Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed and Regime Change. Number 2, Peter Thiel. I mentioned to you the Straussian moment, the book 0 to 1. But here you have Thiel's influence as a longtime friend. Curtis Yarvin, some of you may know. Okay, so what do you think about this set of influences? Is this net positive? I would say so. Renee Girard. Amari, okay, I don't know too much about what he writes, except for what's said here and the fact that he is co-editor of Compact Magazine, which has had its own little scandal recently. I don't know the details, don't want to get into the details. I know that I've published for them before. Claremont Institute, and Orthodox Christian writer and former American conservative columnist Rod Dreher. So there are some other articles, as I mentioned to you, on this topic that have come out recently that I figured we would cover on this stream, and we're going to move on now to the next one. I did not pre-read these, we're reading them together. So this is from thespectator.com, and it's called The Intellectual Journey of JD Vance. You ready? My name is Michael Millerman. Oh, sorry, this is, when I pulled this up originally, it was not behind a paywall. Now it is behind a paywall, so I didn't really cue this up correctly. Sorry about that. You can either look at it separately, or maybe I will get a free account and put that up in a minute. But for now, we move on to, what do we have here? Unheard.com, JD Vance and the New Right. This is not blocked, I think. Oh, this one is blocked too. Strange. When I pulled these up in preparation for our live stream today, these were not blocked off articles. So where are they? What's going on? Oh, this is to listen. No, we don't want to listen. We want to read. Let's pull it up and read it. 1 second. Where is it here? JD Vance. Oh, so this is not an article. It's a video. Okay, my bad. Well, there you go. Unheard.com, JD Vance and the New Right. You'll be able to watch this this presentation. So I won't cover that. Okay, but you can take a look at that yourselves. The key thing that I want to convey to you is that Trump's VP pick has energized certain circles on the intellectual right, the dissident right. Now, you might think, like I see people saying in the chat, that look, like Robert Skiff writes here, it's a lot of narrative prep to make Vance look like a right-wing nut. Maybe. Have a, the article is highly speculative. Meetings and podcast interviews don't make a deep influence. Yes, that's true. But on the other hand, for those of you who are on the intellectual right, the dissident right, who are sort of interested in what I call the virtues of right-wing anti-liberalism. I have an essay and a video on that topic, the virtues of right-wing anti-liberalism. For those of you who are into that topic, it should be energizing that the pick was somebody who knows at least some of these people, some of these names, schools, movements, organizations, institutions, trends, tendencies, as opposed to somebody who's totally disconnected from them. It is important, if you care about the relationship of ideas to the sources of power, you want to make sure that you have people in and near power who are familiar with those ideas. And so you see from the Political article that that's true in a certain sense. Again, how far that goes, how much you can count on it, how do people reconcile contradictory opinions, and how do other incentives come into play? All of that is relevant. But still, at the very least, this should inspire you to go learn more about these authors if he knows more about them than you do, so that you can understand and get on the same page. So, okay, we're not going to do this, but if I tell you where to find it, unheard.com, Oren Cass, JD Vance, and The New Right. Let's see what else we got pulled up here. This article is not behind a paywall. The Courage of JD Vance. I think this is slightly less about the intellectual sources and maybe more about the fact that he's a Republican who is taking a position on certain policies that are not the customary Republican position on those policies. So I want to go over that. And then if we have time and interest, there's a related article here by Richard Hanania, Understanding the Tech Right, which is extremely important points and coming up in my conversations in private tutoring. So I have people who come to me to learn about these authors, people in tech and investing and so on. And this idea that something is unprecedented about Trump 2024 compared to Trump 2016. What's truly unprecedented, as Chris Rufo and others have noted, is that there are high-profile tech defectors moving now to openly support Trump. And there's a growing list of these new Trump supporting tech millionaires and billionaires and influential players. And it's no longer quite so deplorable to support Trump. He's got a lot of money coming behind him, a lot of influence coming behind him, and a lot of, intellectual firepower as well. So Hanania has called that, I believe he coined this term, I don't know, maybe others have used it, the tech right. And I kind of want to read about that as well. But first, let's go stick on the topic of JD Vance specifically. We'll look at this article, compactmag.com, Daniel McCarthy, July 16, The Courage of JD Vance. Okay, by the way, I'm Michael Millerman. I really appreciate you guys spending your time here. Hopefully you're finding it interesting to learn a little bit about Trump's VP. And if you saw the RNC, the Republican National Convention yesterday, and you saw Hulk Hogan and Dana White and Kid Rock, and then the man himself, Donald Trump, deliver a great long speech. Amazing times, amazing times. You guys think Biden's going to drop out? Who's going to replace him? A lot to think about, to talk about, but let's stick with JD Vance. Here we go. Compactmag.com. To understand the full political significance of JD Vance's selection as Trump's running mate, one has to look back more than 30 years to a time when Vance himself was just a boy. In the early 1990s, in the afterglow not of nuclear war, but of a miraculously peaceful end to the Cold War, conservative thinkers and statesmen started to think again. Capitalism no longer simply meant the opposite of communism. American foreign policy could no longer be oriented towards containing or rolling back a Soviet Union that no longer existed. And the counterculture of sex, drugs, and alternative lifestyles, which had served as an uneasy ally against the communist system that denied personal autonomy, along with the existence of God, was no longer in any sense on the same side as religion, family, and traditional community. Okay, so with the end of communism, the end of the Cold War, the situation changed and conservative thinkers had to think again. You know that if the Fukuyama and the opponents of the end of history thesis and so on. Yet anti-communist ideological antibodies didn't die with the disease. Instead, they became an autoimmune disorder attacking society itself. Ideological capitalism, rebranded as globalization or neoliberalism, or a half dozen other terms, took the place of revolutionary Marxism as a scientific and moral imperative. Alliances against communist blocs ceased to be defensive alliances. When those blocs ceased to exist, they expanded. These alliances were now imperial with a police-keeping mission that extended far beyond the borders of their member states. The United States itself became a quote-unquote universal nation and a quote-unquote indispensable nation. Not really a nation at all, but a self-appointed sheriff of human rights and trade routes and intellectual property rights around the globe. Voters didn't get much of a say in this. The treaties and institutions that made it all possible had been set up decades ago for very different purposes. The treaties didn't expire with the threats they were designed to meet, right? So Soviet Union goes away, NATO doesn't disappear. And the ghost of countercultural freedom lived on too even in the hearts or other parts of younger, yuppie conservatives. The cultural picture was a great deal more complicated, since rethinking capitalism and hegemonic foreign policy once again put many cultural conservatives on the same side as old hippies, some Marxists, and even certain postmodernists. What's more, reconsidering capitalism didn't necessarily mean embracing anti-capitalism of either a traditionalist or old left variety. Some on the right, the paleo-libertarians, tried to recover a capitalism that wasn't part of the Cold War project and its intemperate imperial heir. Okay, guys, you know this if you've been paying attention to movements on the right, kind of a suspicion towards the free market ideology, the idea that nonstop capital accumulation is in all cases indisputably good. Okay, some sort of suspicion towards capital on the anti-liberal, illiberal, or how could you put it, alternative right. In 1992, Pat Buchanan and in a quirkier way, Ross Perot, signaled the homeward turn of the right. The Wall Street Journal editorial pages called for open borders. Buchanan opposed mass immigration. Sinicured neoconservatives called for America to export democracy and go abroad in search of rogue states to destroy. Buchanan, the old Richard Nixon hand, said it was time to come home America. He supported tariffs and opposed free trade agreements and the admission of the People's Republic of China to the World Trade Organization and other global economic institutions. Buchanan was a staunch social conservative as well. This put him at odds with Perot and with many on the left who grudgingly admitted he was onto something with his economics and foreign policy, though immigration remained a sticking point for many otherwise curious progressives. By the way, how incredible is it that Trump's life was saved by a head turn towards an immigration chart? Buchanan was a standard bearer in politics, but the movement, or rather the mood he led, wasn't simply Buchananite. Russell Kirk, Robert Nisbet, the paleoconservatives of Chronicles magazine, by the way, you might want to take a look at Chronicles magazine. I have been interviewed by them several years ago, and they do things that are worth looking at. I talked about Dugan on one of their podcasts recently. Okay, so Chronicles magazine, you should know about if you don't know. The paleoconservatives of Chronicles magazine, paleo-libertarians, and many others rallied around his, that means Buchanan's, banner. They were all rethinking the right and the post-Cold War world. This made many of them seem prophetic decades later after the rise of Donald Trump. Okay, so guys, those of you who are just checking in, right, we're reading compactmag.com's article on the courage of JD Vance, and the background here is the paleo-conservative Buchanan opposition to global liberal capitalism. And that was a sort of precursor to Trump. To repeat, this made many of them seem prophetic decades later after the rise of Donald Trump. There were critics of these thinkers who nonetheless took them seriously, or who, failing that, were fascinated by the face of evil, which is what the neoconservatives and liberals of the turn of the new century considered these men and women to be. The same hyperbole that characterizes the denunciations of Trump and Vance today was typical of how movement conservatives and triumphant liberal internationalists talked and wrote about the Buchananite right in the 1990s. Yet despite rote denunciations, the smarter sort of opponent recognized that there was some truth in the extreme things the paleos said, or at a minimum, some validity to the questions they were raising. Now, guys, I want to ask those of you who are here, if depending on your age, were you followers of Buchanan, of the paleo-conservatives, of Chronicles magazine, Paul Gottfried, are these new names to you, or are these people known entities to you that you once used to support? So sorry, it's going to look ugly on the screen a little bit, but the way for me to read this, I got to move it over like that. Vance has a rich biography, of which his best-selling 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, is a powerful part. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps. He earned degrees from Ohio State University and Yale Law School. He succeeded in finance, and in the Obama era was already making his voice heard and ideas known as a writer. Vance came of age as a public voice at a time of, dare I say, post-paleo-conservatism. The George W. Bush years had ended in disaster for Republicans in the conservative movement. There were attempts by many in Washington and New York to devise something new that wouldn't be paleo or as hard-edged as Buchananism, but that would ask, however belatedly, the questions that had to be asked about capitalism, foreign policy, and the nexus of society and morality in the era after the Manichaean struggle with communism. Ross Douthat, Ryan Salem, Yuval Levin, and numerous others became reform conservatives or moved in parallel with those who accepted that label. David Frum was one of the 1990s neoconservatives, who had taken the trouble to read the paleoconservatives, if only to more forcefully denounce them. He served in the George W. Bush administration, where he promoted war with the cockamamie concept of the axis of evil. Afterward, he had an association for some time with National Review, until he had a bitter split with the magazine that in 2003 had published his anti-war conservative screed, Unpatriotic Conservatives. Having been kicked out of movement conservatism, whatever was left of it at that point, he set up his own website, From Forum, before he alighted on a perch at the Atlantic. A young JD Vance, who at 39 isn't exactly old today, hey, as a 40-year-old, that makes me happy to hear, contributed to the short-lived From Forum. A few years later came Hillbilly Elegy, and after that, some personal text messages and public statements expressing distaste for Donald Trump in strong terms. These remarks are now the stuff of CNN exposés and attempts to embarrass the 2024 GOP ticket. The story about Vance, that from Romney and the media that hate Trump would like everyone to accept, goes as follows. Vance was a smart and compassionate man who sold his soul to the devil, first for a Senate seat, now for a slot on Satan's own presidential ticket. Trump is a rich man who isn't a populist of any kind, despite the curious fact that ordinary people who have been screwed over by elites keep voting for him. He's a populist in their eyes, but what do they know? Vance had all the makings of a good, respectable member of the slightly chastened liberal or neoconservative elite. He had made money, he had the Ivy League imprimatur, and is far from elite background and homeborn concern for the pathologies of hillbilly America were qualities that could give his more privileged peers a bit of compassionate rouge. That was the role the system expected Vance to play. The one thing he must absolutely not do is convert any of his experience or heart or understanding into radical words or actions, like running for office as a populist or speaking out in favor of Trump instead of against him. To connect the critique to politics like that would be to commit the same sin as Buchanan. Okay, so the ghost of paleoconservatism. He too could have been a good conservative if only he hadn't talked about tariffs or the Persian Gulf War. Vance had the courage and moral acuity to turn away from respectability and take up populism. I see a comment in the chat. I always want to give credit where it's due, guys. A reminder, I'm reading here from compactmag.com, The Courage of JD Vance, published several days ago, July 16th. Vance had the courage and moral acuity to turn away from respectability and take up populism. And he has been consistent. If his criticisms of Trump in 2017 were over the top, some of his words on the campaign trail in 2022 were too. Vance is consistently bold, even if he hasn't always been right. What I, the author says, have noticed in attending his speeches over the last few years, however, is that he's a very quick learner, and he has become more effective as he has become more modulated. Vance will be attacked in the weeks to come, perhaps even more than Trump himself will, with every hard-edged statement hyped by the Republicans' opponents as a sign of illiberal sinfulness. Vance is ready for that. He's a Marine. He's faced worse. There's another consistent quality to be found in Vance's remarks before and after his entry into populist politics. He cares deeply about the plight of ordinary Americans and the policies that have served them ill. But in 2016 and 2017, people in Vance's position were told by those who claimed to sympathize with their attempts to reform foreign policy, economics, and conservatism itself, that everything they cared about would be destroyed by association with Donald Trump, a man who was sure to lose in a landslide to Hillary Clinton. The only way to save, say, the cause of realism in foreign policy or economic nationalism in trade and immigration was to sever these things from any association with Trump. The only way to salvage the issues that Trump was championing was to trash Trump himself. So a clean, respectable Republican like Mitt Romney could take up the working class interest or foreign policy restraint. This counsel that Vance received, and I, the author says, know exactly what it sounded like because I received it too, was often sincerely intended but always seriously off base. There is simply no substitute for supporting the politician who supports your cause. And it's vain to hope your enemies will champion your beliefs better if you just show them you're a nice cooperative guy. Vance chose not to cooperate, and now he is in for the same fury that has long been unleashed against Trump. The work of uprooting The Soviet legacy in post-Cold War Russia was never completed. The work of uprooting the Cold War neoliberal legacy in our country is still ongoing. Conservatives have fundamental questions to face that the clash with the USSR disguised for decades. Okay, between, you could say, neoconservatism and paleoconservatism. Vance is not only facing up to those questions, he is answering them. All right, there you go. That was a nice article. That is called The Courage of JD Vance by Daniel McCarthy, compactmag.com, July 16th. And at the bottom, you see that Daniel McCarthy is editor-in-chief of Modern Age. So if you enjoyed that article, you should follow him at Tory Anarchist, and you should go to Modern Age and see what else he's writing and what else they're publishing. You know, I've told you before, if you've been here before, that I like to do these article readings with you because I think sometimes you'll find them interesting and you won't have read them on your own. So we're giving some distribution to the authors and publications here. By the way, I don't ask them, okay? I don't ask them permission. I don't get paid to do this by them. I just want to share with you articles on topics that I think are interesting. But the best way to make this a virtuous circle is that if you liked it, you should go check out what those publications are doing. And if you like this channel, you should support the channel as well. So we looked at this. Again, I like to do a quick recap always for those of you who are just checking in. We did Politicos, the 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview. 2 articles that I did not read because my mistake, they're behind not behind a paywall. I think you could read them for free, but I didn't do it and I don't want to do it now. So there's the intellectual journey of JD Vance at The Spectator. There's JD Vance and the New Right. Okay, I mentioned to you in reference to one of the articles, JD Vance was a guest on Jack Murphy Live, a nice interview that you might want to listen to, that he has these other good characteristics and that he's energized, in my opinion, as I watched his nomination and the response to it, he's energized all the right people. Okay, all the people who are reading and discussing Thiel, Strauss, Girard, weren't mentioned in these articles, but also like Schmidt, you know, the people that I discuss and cover on this channel, because it's something other than mainstream conservative Republicanism. It's something other than the neoconservative Republican consensus. It's something that has to incorporate new sources of intellectual understanding. So we have a little bit of time left, and I wanted to go over this article with you as well, which I have not pre-read. I'll give you a quick word once more here that the purpose of this article is, unlike the other ones, not to see the main intellectual influences on JD Vance. Okay, that's what we covered. Now we're moving to a slightly different topic. It's related because you saw that Peter Thiel, for example, is one of the influences. And really what this article I think is about, or why I want to read it with you, is because in 2016, it was like, you know, the mark of Cain to be a Trump supporter. You know that, right? People are getting fired. People are getting delegitimized, smeared, accused of this and that, insulted. And you had relatively few high-profile tech Trump supporters. Peter Thiel was a conspicuous exception, I would say, and there were maybe a small handful of others, but there has since been a tsunami of support for Trump in high-profile tech circles. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. If you don't, I'm telling you, and we're going to see it in the article. You have people now openly coming out and saying what they wouldn't openly come out and say then. Seeing what they didn't see then, doing what they didn't do then. And this wave of support for Trump by high-profile, kind of like right-wing anti-liberals in the tech sphere is fascinating. Now, I should tell you, this is not a pitch, but I have to tell you this, okay? I teach online, millermanschool.com, and I tutor privately. And when I first started teaching online, I didn't have an ideal customer in mind. I just knew the books I wanted to teach, okay? I got blacklisted from academia for my work on a certain controversial thinker. I knew I wanted to teach, but I didn't have a specific target market. So I just put my courses online. And what I found was that a lot of people from Silicon Valley, from tech, from software engineering, Bitcoin, readers of Peter Thiel, these people were coming to study with me. I didn't know that. I didn't realize before I was teaching online that there's an appetite for political philosophy, cutting edge political philosophy, whether we're talking about the serious study of the old sources like Plato and Aristotle, or, you know, people wanted to discuss Heidegger's Being and Time with me who were in Silicon Valley. That was new. That was a new thing. I didn't know that. Now it's been several years. I get it a little bit more. But I think that is related to this new group of people who are coming to support Trump. It's funny because they're somehow anti-big tech, but not anti-tech. So you can look, I think Mark Andreessen, I haven't read it yet, but he's got an article on little tech versus big tech. Okay. And he just put out a podcast interview with Andreessen Horowitz on big tech, little tech, and supporting Trump. They've come out in support of Trump. So you have people, you have this strange combination. This is new, guys. This is not like George W. Bush, Francis Fukuyama, end of history, neoconservatism. This is new. You have, on one hand, paleoconservative influences. On the other hand, technological illiberal influences. Okay. On the other hand, accelerationist, Promethean. It's a strange, wonderful, beautiful, fascinating conglomeration of forces now around Trump, and it's new. So with that in mind, we look at this post by Richard Hanania. This is from richardhanania.com. You see the spelling of his name here up on screen. This is his Substack. Understanding the tech right. The next decade will be shaped by Silicon Valley fully entering our politics. Now, keep in mind, if you see the publication date, this is just over a month ago. Prescient in the sense that I think there have been even more high-profile defections in tech circles to Trump recently. You look at Bill Ackman's posts on Twitter, you'll see he's got a long list of people who have now been supporting Trump. Okay, partially maybe because you have a Thiel protege, JD Vance, as a VP. They think, look, this is an opportunity that we didn't have when it was Mike Pence. Okay, so just I want to point out, this is okay, June 5th. So this could be updated even now, but let's see what he has to say. Guys, this will be our last article because then I got to get ready for jiu-jitsu. I do want to say my name is Michael Millerman. I teach online, Millerman School. You see all the links in the description. I appreciate you spending your time here. I hope that you're finding this interesting. All credit to the authors and publications. And give me 1 second to drink my coffee and water here, and then we'll launch into it. In the meantime, I put your comments up on screen here, okay? All right, very, very nice to be with you. Here we go. What's happened with free speech on the internet in the last year is quite remarkable. Twitter was a platform that dominated public discourse, amplifying left-wing points of view and suppressing conservatives. It was the main tool relied upon by those in media, academia, and activism to cancel those with views they disapprove of. Okay, some of you may have been canceled before for something that you wrote or liked or replied to or reposted on Twitter. And then a guy just bought it. As I pointed out before the sale to Elon, conservatives adopting an approach of let income inequality run wild and hope a few of the rich guys are on your side is not a bad strategy. In fact, it's a better strategy than winning over intellectuals, who I, Richard Haney writes, see as having a tendency towards being effeminate and conformist, in contrast to guys who make a lot of money. Maybe that's what the Paul Ryans of the world were doing the whole time. Timnit Gebru, one of those people whose whole career is to make sure AI doesn't say anything politically incorrect, has coined the term tescrial, which stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. An academic named Emil Torres is very concerned that tescrial is rising as a self-conscious ideological movement. Then you see this post on screen, Emil Torres saying, the term tescrial is catching on. I think this is a good thing. People are making it clear that they aren't actually interested in a future for quote unquote all humanity, but rather embrace a profoundly impoverished, exclusionary, techno-utopian vision that directly grew out of eugenics. Gebru and Torres, Hanania continues, are easy to mock, but they're generally correct that there's something very interesting happening in tech. In addition to Musk buying Twitter and boosting data on race and crime, which guys, if you're on Twitter X, just see what Musk posts and you'll see, one can point to the long-running intellectual and political activity of Peter Thiel, okay, Straussian moment, 0 to 1, Andreessen, told you he's got a piece out on little tech, and Balaji, we haven't discussed them too much on this channel, but you can look them up, as openly right-wing pundits, Brian Armstrong shutting down woke activism at his company, and David Sachs and Joe Lonsdale joining Elon as major supporters of DeSantis. Okay, guys, here's an example of an update. David Sachs and Joe Lonsdale are joining Elon as major supporters of somebody, of Trump. Okay, they're now all in on Trump. Last year, you even had Bezos putting out some anti-Biden tweets. One can consider Vivek as part of this shift too, with his background in biotech. There are also conservatives in the industry who usually don't discuss their views publicly, but are Republican donors, a category that includes Douglas Leone of Sequoia Capital, former Oracle CEO Larry Ellison, and current CEO Safra Katz. Substack itself, which we're reading from here, richardhanania.com Substack. Substack itself was created to explicitly push back against leftist suppression of speech. While it wouldn't be correct to say that most tech entrepreneurs are conservative, the industry has produced a large share of right-wing thinkers and activists of a higher stature than what we're used to. Guys, I have to give you my anecdotal evidence that this is true, okay? The most interesting people who come to study with me privately are right-wing thinkers in tech. Yes, sometimes in education. Yes, sometimes in law. Yes, sometimes in other fields. But the most interesting people that I have met in the last several years coming to study Heidegger, Schmidt, Strauss, Dugin, and these other thinkers with me, including Plato and Aristotle, are right-wingers in tech. It's amazing. I didn't know that. I didn't know that such a group existed. If you want further evidence that there's a large right-wing contingent in Silicon Valley, Hanania continues, note that when I polled my readers about their backgrounds and occupations, by far the most common field was tech. Okay, tech, you see, if you're looking at the screen, tech is number one, followed by academia, government, medicine, banking, think tank, and law. So in my case, it's not quite this way. Tech is number one for sure. Law is higher because I teach books like Plato's Laws, but yeah, tech. This might be surprising, Hanania continues, given that I've never worked in tech, have no connections to the industry, and have written next to nothing on the topic. But the chart above makes sense if you think TESCREAL has real influence, since the ideology often described by its critics is not too far off from my worldview. Over the years, he continues, I've followed successful tech entrepreneurs who have reputations as public intellectuals while getting to know some of them personally. There are clearly some things that unite this group, and other than scholars in the field of TESCREAL studies, I haven't seen anyone try to spell out what exactly they are. Since TESCREAL sounds horrible to my ears and is painful to look at, let's call it the tech right. Okay, this guy's gets better branding, right? TESCREAL, think about it. You'd have to remember everything it stands for, and it doesn't sound like anything. Tech right, much better. This moniker fits both because many of the intellectual leaders and inspirations of this movement work in the tech industry, and because its views on technology are fundamental to its worldview. Here, I'll spell out what the tech right believes, explaining where it disagrees with the left and different strands of the right. While the tech right is right-wing, it can't be called conservative to any meaningful extent unless you want to define the term as whatever is opposed to modern American liberalism. Finally, Richard Hanania writes, I'll share some thoughts on where the tech right goes from here. While it has differences with American conservatism, there's no reason the two sides can't work together for the foreseeable future. The shapes of our politics and culture in the coming decades will depend on how and to what extent they do. Guys, if you're somebody who wants to understand what's going on in politics, you have to understand what Richard Hanania is talking about here. Okay, the rise of the tech right is a thing. It is a thing. I speak here, I think, with some experience, and if you don't mind my saying, with some authority, but don't take my word for it. We're going to read his article. Right-wingers for progress. Here we go. In our current politics, one can simplify the world by saying that conservatives are in favor of hierarchy and against change, while liberals are against hierarchy and for change. While this isn't how things always work out in practice, and there are many nuances and qualifiers one could add, this is at least how each side perceives itself. The tech right combines the acceptance of inequality of the right with the openness to change of the left. Okay, I really want to say something here. Let me at least finish the paragraph. Okay, I want to make sure you guys get that. That's a nice little way of putting it, okay? So again, conservatives are in favor of hierarchy and against change, you might think. Liberals are against hierarchy and for change. The tech right combines the acceptance of inequality of the right with the openness to change of the left. Okay, nice formulation there. That's useful. The pro-change, anti-equality quadrant is the sweet spot for support for capitalism. So of course they tend to favor free market economic policies. This explains the enthusiasm in this world for Bitcoin, which represents the long-standing libertarian dream of society moving away from fiat currency. And guys, I have to tell you again, just anecdotally, it's not obvious, right? I teach Heidegger, Nietzsche, these other political philosophers in my school. And yet a lot of the people who have come to me have been Bitcoin enthusiasts, Bitcoin developers. The first time I was ever paid in Bitcoin was people who paid for my courses. And in October, I may end up speaking at a Bitcoin conference. Okay, I'm not an expert in Bitcoin, but somehow there's a hunger in those circles for certain ideas. The tech right believes in biology having a large role in determining individual and group outcomes. Okay, the tech right believes in biology having a large role in determining individual and group outcomes. This is simply a matter of what liberals call following the science, except in this case, that's actually what they're doing. Traits like intelligence and work ethic, in fact, all traits indeed have a strong genetic bias. While talented individuals create new things, when talented individuals create new things, it inevitably disrupts old technologies, practices, and ways of life. History shows that the trade-off has pretty much always been worth it. If you think the Enlightenment was a mistake because eventually we got transgenderism, you need some perspective. Okay, there are people, I cover on this channel like Dugan, who that's what they think, right? The Enlightenment was a mistake because eventually we got transgenderism. Not Hanania's view here, and not, in his view, the position of the tech right. Although the tech right may or may not claim Steven Pinker as an inspiration, they generally share his basic philosophy that life has been getting better. The tech right looks at the graphs at our world in data, marvels at how far we've come, and knows that at every step of the way, everything good that we have was at some point opposed with plausible sounding appeals to equality or tradition. What are the odds that naysayers are right this time? Some among the tech right think that AI doomers have a good argument, but they usually believe most other supposed existential threats like climate change and misinformation are overblown. Guys, if you want an example, I covered Mark Andreessen on AI doomerism. I can't remember. I think it's called Why AI Will Save the World or something like that. Okay, so a very optimistic interpretation of the potentials of new AI technologies. So this is what he's talking about. The tech right is optimistic with respect to new technologies. Falling birth rates is another problem the tech right takes more seriously than the mainstream. And if one wanted to seriously argue against progress, pointing to declining fertility is the best case one can make. That being said, no one wants to live like a medieval peasant, and one can't force people to be religious if science and access to information has made it less plausible. So it's unclear what traditionalists can actually offer people in this area. Guys, I'm going to interrupt the article for a minute because I want to make just a quick point, okay? Just a very quick, I just want to tell you something very quickly, okay? One of the authors I teach in my school, I don't say this to sell the school because I want you to know the author. His name is Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, and he's got a book called The Lonely Man of Faith. One of the reasons I love the book, The Lonely Man of Faith, and one of the reasons I teach it is because a lot of anti-modern, anti-liberal thinkers are also anti-tech. And you want to try to understand, is there an account that is not just pro-tech, but pro-tech without that being at the expense of our humanity, without it being at the expense of our religiosity, our attitude towards God, the deep level of the human soul. Somehow it seems like technological progress covers over the deep level of the human soul. So this book, The Lonely Man of Faith by Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, is a very nice book because it suggests that there are two roots to human nature, that both are God-given, and he sees this in the two accounts of the creation of man in Genesis, and one legitimates our technological urges, inclinations, and accomplishments, and the other legitimates our contemplative life, the life of faith, redemption, prayer, religiosity, piety, and inactivity in that way. So I think that is extremely important. That's why I teach that book in the school. Okay, you need to have an interpretation somewhere in your model of tech that is positive without being destructive of our humanity. Okay, back to the article. Appropriately enough, the tech right is more likely to put its faith in technology to get us out of this problem, and we can already see that in Denmark, 10% of births are produced by IVF. The experience of Israel indicates that if technology caused lower birth rates, it can also contribute to reversing the trend towards smaller families. In addition to IVF and other services already available, let me pull this back up on screen. Already available, biotech companies are working on delaying menopause, and whether or not any particular procedure or drug comes to fruition, The next several decades are sure to see new consumer products that give people more and more control of when and how they have children, along with what traits they have. Guys, this is another huge topic, okay? I covered it on this channel. There was a great article about bioengineering, Fukuyama, human nature, and technology. This is what you must be thinking about now. Okay, so what do you do with the rise of biotech if you're a defender of human nature as a crucial element of conservative political thought and practice? Okay, amazing, amazing topic as well. But we'll just continue with the article. So far, highly enjoying it. richardhanania.com, Understanding the Tech Right. The lack of concern with social and economic inequality is the basis of anti-TESCREAL criticism. Okay, it's the basis of the anti-tech criticism. The lack of concern with social and economic inequality. Okay, probably like this person in the chat who said Peter Thiel is a fascist. That's probably part of it. Okay. You can see the funny ways in which these academics think here when Torres argues that they're racist for caring about existential risks to humanity instead of racism, etc. Because if you prevent extinction, there will still be inequality. To me, there's nothing inherently right-wing, the author continues, about worrying about existential risk. But if your general orientation to politics and life is to be obsessed with race and gender issues and to see everything else as a distraction from them, then I guess it makes sense. If religious fundamentalism dominated American institutions, the tech right would probably be known for its opposition to it and might have to be classified as a left-wing movement. As such, institutions are dominated by wokeness, and so this is the mind virus it struggles against. Talking to the tech right, it seems many of them have had their views shaped by spending a lot of time in San Francisco and wondering why the homeless are defecating everywhere. As soon as an open-minded individual starts thinking about crime and urban disorder, they find that misguided compassion and anti-racism are why the country can't have nice things. A belief in natural inequality causes the tech right to also oppose wokeness when it comes to affirmative action and diversity. A lot of liberals work in areas like activism, academia, or government, where there aren't good objective measures of success or failure, except perhaps the ability to produce a lot of paperwork. This leads to an assumption that there isn't that much of a trade-off between diversity and what we want institutions to be able to accomplish. People with backgrounds in business, particularly industries that produce tangible products, tend to take a different perspective. If the tech right sounds mostly like libertarianism, that's because to a large extent it is. There are a few main differences, however. First, while libertarians tend to oppose almost all forms of government spending, the tech right will often make an exception for, unsurprisingly, tech. This might be in part due to self-interest, see the public campaign in favor of bailing out the depositors of Silicon Valley Bank, but it's also the result of enthusiasm for big projects that can move humanity forward. Even libertarians can acknowledge that the production of fundamental scientific knowledge may be called a collective action problem. So may end up underproduced in a free market system. While the left wants to spend money to reduce inequality and the right wants to let the market work things out, the tech right is open to spending money as long as it goes toward cutting-edge science and research. Moreover, Richard Hanania continues on his Substack article, Understanding the Tech Right, big libertarianism has in recent years funded and supported those in favor of soft-on-crime policies, an effort that is known as criminal justice reform. The tech right tends to be strongly in favor of law and order. This disagreement might be rooted in different fundamental ideas about human nature and the causes of individual variation in life outcomes. While some forms of more politically correct libertarianism might tend towards blank slateism, which leads to the belief that criminals can be reformed and turned into productive members of society, biological realism suggests a different path. The tech right has differences with mainstream conservatism that are in many ways much more fundamental than those they have with libertarianism. Basically, if you want to know where the tech right and the mainstream right diverge, just look at Elon Musk's Twitter feed and find the places where he disagrees with his biggest fans. Musk has come out in favor of legal immigration and euthanasia, at least for adults. He seems to carefully go out of his way not to take a stand on abortion. On immigration and trade, one can think of restrictionism as a kind of right-wing form of affirmative action. Conservatives realize that diversity leads to a less productive workforce and slows down human progress, but somehow also believe that preferring Americans over the other 7.5 billion people in the world doesn't have serious costs. Conservatives worry about the second-order effects of immigration and talk about how new arrivals might vote or cause a decline in social trust. But the tech right, okay, he's contrasting conservatism and the tech right. The tech right doesn't believe enough in social science to grant that it can tell us much of anything about the political ramifications of population change within reasonable limits. It might be bad because new arrivals support socialist policies, or good because it destroys social trust and decreases support for redistribution. If immigration produces difficulties down the line, deal with them then. Engineers tend to work on problems one at a time as they come up, as that's the only feasible path forward, and public policy should be the same way, particularly since society is much more complicated than any machine or computer program. The tech right tends to be patriotic in ways that are different from a typical Republican. This group may be called globalist in that it thinks internationally and is less inclined than most to make fundamental distinctions in moral worthiness based on whether an individual is a fellow citizen or not. That being said, tech right patriotism is rooted in a vision of national greatness, or America as the force in the world that best represents the legacy of the Enlightenment and the one nation still able to do great things. As you saw, I add here if you watched yesterday's Republican National Convention. European economic, cultural, and technological stagnation looms large in their minds. Some members of the tech right have shown a bit of admiration for China on the same basis, though that has cooled in recent years due to policies like the tech crackdown and zero COVID, as it appears under Xi and is following the European path of preferring stability and safety over greatness. All this is in contrast with the more parochial patriotism of mainstream conservatism, which is simply attached to the country and doesn't want it to change much. My experience, Hanania continues, with the tech right is that this crowd is becoming more tribal, and so individuals will really go out of their way to exaggerate their differences with the left and downplay those with the right. When I try to explain to people in this world that certain conservative positions are bad, they find excuses as to why certain things should be overlooked or why conservatives will never be able to accomplish their ultimate goals anyway. At the same time, when it comes to places where they disagree with the liberals, they always imagine them enacting the most extreme forms of their preferred policies without giving a second thought to their feasibility, while having a vivid imagination when it comes to slippery slopes. Okay, hold on. I just want to see here. How much of this do we want to go through? If we want to go through the whole article, let's skim a little bit. Okay, the tech right is pretty much all male. Where did the tech right come from? Let's see here. I'm going to skim a little bit, okay, guys, because it's a good article. You should read it. I want you to read it. I've enjoyed reading it so far. This is not a slight on the article, but I just want to skim here and see if we pull out a couple ideas. What's this? One thing I've noticed from talking to conservatives in academia. Oh yeah, this I don't know. So you would think he's talking here about academia now. You would think that people who try to become professors are those most interested in ideas. You might have thought that at some point. My experience is, if anything, the opposite, he says. And hey, I was blacklisted from academia for my interest in ideas, so relatable. They're the kind of people who like the idea of thinking about themselves as people interested in ideas, but actually lack genuine curiosity about the world. If they did have curiosity about the world, they would go participate in it, where they'd have real experiences, find out how it works, and not spend their time bogged down in so much paperwork. To the extent they want to produce intellectually important work, they would want to share it with the world, rather than write in impenetrable jargon directed at a select few. Of course, there are exceptions, but the majority of academics have little to nothing important to say because they're playing a status game, not a truth game. One thing I've noticed, Tanania says, from talking to conservatives in academia is the university bureaucracy provides endless opportunities for their enemies to persecute them. The complaint processes surrounding ethics and anti-harassment are extremely easy to abuse. Guys, if you've ever been in and around HR that made it easy for somebody to go after you, you know that. And one's professional life can be ruined even if an individual has done nothing wrong. Left-wing academics are good with paperwork, small-minded and vengeful, making them very skilled at navigating these systems and bending them to their ends. Hey, if you watched the Republican National Convention yesterday and you saw Trump's speech, what did he say about Democrats? He said they're very effective when it comes to paperwork, but they're not fighting for the good of the country in these other important domains. And Hananian's saying the same thing about Democrats in academia, basically, or left-wingers in academia. They don't need to actually ban heretical ideas, but instead use the machinery of academia to gradually grind down those who won't conform, as they did with Joshua Katz. Always keep in mind that academics are the people who selected into this world, and they did so for less money than they could have earned doing something else. Since their reward is being part of a priestly class, of course, they're going to defend established dogma. One can think of tech as the inverse of academia. By the way, another interesting thing, like I met all of these tech right how could you put it? I met some tech right people and I had tech right people coming to study with me when I left academia. When I was in academia, I had no inkling of the existence of this class of thinkers, actors, inventors, investors, funders, founders. So that's another thing. I can see this. One can think of tech as the inverse of academia. The guy who starts something in his garage, cliche, doesn't get applied to many industries. Peter Thiel talks about how progress has stagnated in the world of atoms while moving forward in the world of bits. There appear to be two reasons for this. First, much of the low-hanging fruit has already been picked in the world of atoms, while software development is a relatively new field. Orville and Wilbur Wright could tinker around for a while and discover how to fly, but you and your brother probably aren't going to be making advances in aviation on your own. Also, the world of bits, being new and having potential harms that are more abstract, has been subject to much less regulation than the world of atoms. Nuclear power is the canonical example of an industry that has been strangled by government. There are endless barriers to anyone who wants to do anything that requires moving objects around rather than manipulating symbols on a screen. Guys, I interrupt here. I went to a startup conference in Montreal last week called Startup Fest, and there was a good presentation about this as well, where the particular speaker was encouraging people to, not that there's anything, don't get this wrong. If you're about to be criticized by what he said, it's not a big deal, okay? But he said, everybody's making apps, everybody's making apps. And what about deep tech? What about solving problems of industrial manufacturing? What about solving problems of, on a huge scale that are not primarily software problems? So Hanania here is saying, look, governments have made that very difficult to do. There are endless barriers to anyone who wants to do anything that requires moving objects around rather than manipulating symbols on a screen. So it's not just that people go into app development because they don't want to, go into satellite technology, but the way to get started in satellite technology is, huge amounts of money plus government regulation. What are you going to do? Continuing with the article, while the vast majority of the donations of tech employees go to Democrats, that's why the recent round of billionaire tech defections onto the Trump team is so conspicuous. Corporate PACs and CEOs seem to be more evenly divided. This makes sense from the perspective that leftism is a result of conformity. Those who went out on their own and founded a new industry are more likely to question dogma than those who go to work in the field once it's well established. One can think of institutions as existing on a spectrum of bureaucratization. At one end, most centered around producing useless paperwork, is the modern university. At the other end of the spectrum is starting your own company, millermanschool.com, where it can just be you and your friends. Generally, the more bureaucratized the institutions, the more they appeal to conformists. The world of bits has for decades been the place where a talented and independent-minded young man with mediocre and below average social skills and connections is most likely to make his fortune. Okay, so for you introverted autists who are smart and who don't want to push paper and don't like big group meetings, open a business. Successful tech entrepreneurs at first mostly stayed out of politics. Around 2010, they were generally associated with the left, as Bill Gates began to be involved in areas like climate change and education reform. Then came the Great Awakening. Before that point, a reasonable person could ignore politics and assume that the people in charge were mentally stable and knew what they were doing. Yet it became clear over time that journalists and academics had lost their minds on everything having to do with race or sexuality. Guys, I still think it's very sad what happened to university, at least to those parts of it that were taken over by this strange obsession with race and gender. The media turned on tech itself as the pressure came to blindly hate everything that was successful or white, cis, and male. Over time, we see the results of the Great Awakening across our cities, particularly in the Bay Area, where the homeless population has exploded over the years. And guys, since Richard Hanania published this on June 5th, Elon Musk has just, he was in the Bay Area, wasn't he? He's out of there, gone to Texas. Interestingly, the Great Awakening might have contributed to Bill Gates' marriage falling apart. It appears that as a liberal, but one who cared about empirical reality, Gates wanted to put his money where it could do the most good. This caused friction with his wife, who wanted it going toward feminist causes without worrying about whether her preferred initiatives could be justified by the data. COVID may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Having a strong grounding in empirical reality, Silicon Valley was worried about the coronavirus, while much of the liberal establishment was saying it was racist to be concerned. Over time, however, it became clear that lockdowns didn't really help all that much, and we developed vaccines that reduced what already had been a small risk of death for most people down to basically zero. Yet, liberal institutions and jurisdictions, particularly in California, hung on to lockdowns, masking requirements, and security theater for way too long. Elon ended up moving Tesla to Texas over the issue. In sum, the story here is basically that one industry attracted a disproportionate share of smart and nonconformist men. Okay, maybe that's why people come to study Dugin, Schmidt, Heidegger, Strauss, Nietzsche, Aristotle, Plato, because they're nonconformist. They realize there's the great awakening. They want to get back to the great awakening. They know they're not going to do that in mainstream academia, so they come to my little school. They mostly stayed out of politics until the liberal establishment became too irrational and authoritarian to ignore. And unlike most other people who have come to develop a justified hatred of liberalism over the years, they had the resources and influence to do something about it. Guys, love it or hate it, it matters. If you have resources and influence, you can do something. You remember up earlier in the article, you can hate Twitter or love Twitter, but you can't all go buy Twitter. You had to be Elon Musk to do that. Wither the tech right. Okay, I think we're getting close. I got to skim here because I definitely do not want to miss what I got to go to, but we're going to wrap up with this section. Wither the tech right. Okay, richardhanania.com. Understanding the tech right is what we've been reading. Let's do this. American politics over the next decades will to a large extent be shaped, he writes, by what the tech right does. Currently, they seem to be following trends on the right rather than exercising leadership. Again, I would say that in the intervening weeks since this was published, that's changing rapidly. DeSantis, for example, has ridden the wave of anti-wokeness to his position as the only real challenger to Trump. You see that's outdated now. He's therefore attracted both standard conservative intellectuals and members of the tech right, with, as already mentioned, Elon, Sachs, and Lonsdale among his most prominent supporters. Okay, I said earlier in the article, they are now all in on Trump and many others as well. But there's nothing in particular about DeSantis or his campaign that shows an ideological or attitudinal affinity towards the tech right. And by the way, you could say that's not true of Trump because the JD Vance connection really tipped the scales in an important way. That's why we covered JD Vance in the first part of the stream. The Silicon Valley crowd is simply itching its wagon to the most plausible anti-woke candidate who isn't Trump. At the other end of the spectrum, the tech right might start running its own candidates. I doubt this will work, writes Richard Deneen. The Blake Masters campaign can be seen as a failed version of that experiment. There's nothing to indicate that tech right types as individuals have the ability to appeal to a wide swath of voters. Of course, there may be exceptions. Vivek appears to be a natural communicator. And although he's unlikely to win the Republican primary, he's demonstrated a good deal of political talent. Okay, some of you may have seen his speech at the RNC. For the most part, however, the impact of the tech right will depend on their ability and willingness to fund and influence politicians who agree with them, not becoming elected officials themselves. Because again, maybe the JD Vance thing changes that. At the same time, some might plausibly find their way into the federal bureaucracy. Balaji was reportedly in the running to head the FDA under Trump. In between just becoming another species of Republican megadonor and running for office, there's the possibility that the tech right exerts more intellectual leadership over the conservative movement. Okay, guys, in some sense, this is the outcome that people like myself would particularly love because, I work with the intellectual sources. So to be at the middle of the, at the movement, the money, the power, and the ideas is a nice place to be. They certainly have the money and status to do so. The tech right is in many ways anti-populist and will hopefully stand in the way of those trying to make Republicans more friendly to labor unions, entitlement spending, and economic regulation. Okay, as I said, this was written June 5. Richard Hanania, now that JD Vance, with the Thiel connection, is the VP, and the head of the Teamsters was speaking at the RNC, there's a question here about what the dynamics will be between the populists and the tech rightists in the new Republican Party. There's been something of a marriage of convenience between populists and the tech right, he continues, based on the fact that both are anti-woke, but in the end, decisions about how to govern have to be made. According to people who pay close attention to the federal budget, we're eventually going to reach a crisis point where the US will either have to raise taxes on most workers or cut entitlements. Right now, nothing is forcing a split between the populists and free marketers within the Republican coalition. In another decade or so, however, our political elite will have to choose which pill to swallow. And keeping the Republican Party dogmatically anti-tax is the only hope we have, he writes, for not descending further into gerontocracy. My belief is that, this is again Richard Hanania, my belief is that whatever economic populism currently exists on the right is only skin deep, something that is most aggressively championed when it can make Biden look bad, while free market ideals, particularly when it comes to not raising taxes, still have a stronger hold on the minds of educated conservatives. For the tech right, with its belief in economic and technological dynamism, having the country turn into a giant nursing home along the lines of Spain or Japan is a kind of nightmare scenario. heading off economic populism now and not letting conservatives become too attached to protecting entitlements needs to be a top priority. Another place the tech right can push back is against the kind of traditionalism that seeks to run with the naturalistic fallacy and make it central to right-wing politics. Guys, another important point here, you do have to, especially if you have ever followed this channel because of my work on people like Dugin. Dugin is a traditionalist. So you can be anti-woke, anti-liberal, and still at odds over the issue of tech, nature, science, innovation, and transhumanism. I recommend, he says, reading this Mary Harrington profile of Peter Thiel. Harrington and Thiel have both spoken at the same national conservatism conferences, but their views couldn't be further apart, with one horrified by what she calls transhumanism, and the other saying the problem with transhumanism is that it doesn't go far enough. Currently, the strongest anti-progress forces are on the left, but some seem to be rising on the right too, and they, he thinks, Richard Hanania, are worth opposing. One thing the tech right provides to conservatism is intellectual and cultural capital. Some time ago, I saw a kid in a spacesuit who told me he liked Elon Musk. Of course, no kid is growing up wanting to be like a Charles Koch, however you pronounce it, as impressive as he is, or a CNN journalist for that matter, right? People want to be great inventors, scientists, or at least it'd be great if that is what they wanted to be. And that's, kids don't want to grow up to be whatever, right? They're inspired by Rocket Man. Liberals gain to the extent to which they can give the impression that every smart and successful person in the world agrees with them. Guys, that's becoming a hard position to maintain. The tech right, having both tons of money and intellectual and cultural influence, is a powerful combination, and leftists are right to be worried they haven't faced a challenge like this before. I do think that is correct, guys. Okay, the rise of the tech right is significant. Lonsdale's Cicero Institute has already worked to influence state policies on issues like homelessness and removing degree requirements, which you can read about here. There's a link. He's got a link here, richardhanania.com. So if you want to read that, read it. In addition to impacting our politics more generally, tech right figures should hopefully start pushing the Republican Party in their preferred direction by direct lobbying, speaking publicly on important issues, and supporting intellectuals and public candidates they agree with. Short of that, simply highlighting and naming a phenomenon is a way to give it power and influence. Very true. There's a difference between hearing about a few successful tech entrepreneurs who are becoming politically active and understanding them as part of a movement. Until now, the anti-TESCREAL crowd have been the main ones to provide a comprehensive story of what's happening. In other words, those who are against the tech right on the left, they have been sort of seeing like Peter Thiel and his shadowy tech cabal, which I'm a part of, by the way, gandalfschool.com. This essay provides a sympathetic perspective of the same movement. Okay, not an anti perspective, a sympathetic perspective, and hopes to inspire those who have clearly seen the flaws of the left-wing establishment to appreciate the virtues of progress and seize the opportunities that are becoming available to replace them with something better. Very nice read, guys. If you want to check out the comments, 126 comments to Richard Hanania's very nice post from June 5th called Understanding the Tech Right. You always got to give credit where it's due. I enjoyed reading this. I hope you enjoyed hearing it. Maybe you never heard of this guy before or weren't going to read his writing before. Now you know, richardhanania.com. We also read The Courage of JD Vance over at compactmag.com. I also told you about this, which I haven't listened to, and I thought it was an article, so I pulled it up, but we couldn't do it. Oren Cass, JD Vance and the New Right, Intellectual Journey of JD Vance at The Spectator. And finally, we opened this stream with Politico, the 7 thinkers and groups that have shaped JD Vance's unusual worldview. It's a very exciting moment, I think, for intellectuals in the conservative movement, in and around the conservative movement. Guys, it's been a crazy, crazy few days. Okay, Biden at his lowest point, Trump almost dead, and then at his highest point, reborn, re-inspired. Take an interest if you haven't already. Obviously, you're here, so you have. JD Vance, the thinkers he's connected to, what does this all mean? Tech right, paleo-conservatives, populism, anti-neoconservative movement in the Republican Party. Very exciting times, okay? If you have enjoyed this live stream, thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. Like, share, comment to make it easier for this channel to grow so I can bring you more of these great analyses. Guys, if you're interested in what I myself teach, all the links are in the description, including where I teach courses on Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, these other guys. If you want to know more about philosophy and entrepreneurship, I do have a side project I don't talk about very often, visionxform.com. But really just keep on reading, keep on learning, keep on studying, and have a great day. Have a great weekend. See you in the next video.